It's me, I'm back to do another review, this time of Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Now, I'll start with pointing out this is quite a controversial work in history. I know it's got sort of vague connections to Adolf Hitler. Hitler sort of used Nietzsche's philosophy, apparently, in order to justify his Nazism. I will go on the record of saying he was completely delusional. There's nothing in here even remotely connected to Nazism. But then again, Adolf Hitler could twist anything into supporting his ideas. So I will go on record for saying that before I start talking about the book itself. Now I've got that little complaint out of the way, I would just like to say that I've always found the concepts in this book incredibly interesting. And even before I read it, I knew the sort of thing that Nietzsche represented. And I'm very, very much in favour of most of his ideas, at least the ones presented in this book. But almost inevitably, it's a lot more complex than it sounds when just described to you before you even pick up one of the actual books behind the philosophy. What I will say is the stuff that this book actually gives you I didn't expect. It's not a straight up philosophy work. In fact, it's many different things. It's philosophy, but it's at the same time sort of a novel, sort of a book of speeches, and almost an epic poem at the same time. Even in translation, some of the phrases and elongated metaphors are just sublime and brilliant. And it does make a lot of the points even more interesting than they already are. And they are interesting. But yeah, this book has a real aesthetic beauty to it, which I didn't expect from something which is supposedly philosophy, elements of fiction here and there. There's more than just elements. It's a fully blown work of fiction, poetry, you name it. It's very difficult to actually classify in a genre. The book's split up into sections with mini titles, almost like chapters, but I wouldn't say it's quite like that. And it starts off as almost purely philosophical speeches with the odd anecdote from Zarathustra's life here or there. And the more you progress through it, the more the narrative starts seeping in. It's structurally very unusual. But with all these weird stylistic choices in a book which is essentially a work of philosophy by a philosopher, it's easy to forget what it's actually saying. As a strong individualist, someone like me, I would say that I very much endorse this book's view on life, with obviously a few reservations, but I'll get to that in a second. It's just such a positive worldview. There's a line in the book about 2/3 of the way through, which I think summed up everything good about the Nietzschean philosophy perfectly. Zarathustra's been describing what he does for fun, sort of taking a break from the heavy statements. Although eventually it equates to a deeper message about his philosophy, and he says, "This is not the way, this is my way. The way does not exist." That's sort of a fuck you to both religion and sort of the blind absolute moralism that you would get maybe today on both sides of the political spectrum. I'm not making any judgments in that area, but that's what I like about this philosophy, this sort of free moralism. Inevitably, though, there are problems with Nietzsche's philosophy. Partly, he completely disregards women in a way that's misogynistic even for the 19th century. He said women only exist to give birth to the Übermensch, which is not right in any way, shape or form. And it's easy to complain about things being out of tune with our modern world I find it annoying people do that most of the time. Like things like Shakespeare, Taming of the Shrew, people would try and either complain about it or try and reinterpret it to be less misogynistic. It's like, oh, Shakespeare was actually a feminist. But there is no reinterpreting a philosophical work, because a philosophical work tells you what it thinks. It doesn't tell a story which can be endlessly reinterpreted. And this sort of taints the worldview a lot more, I think, than its associations with Nazism, because the Nazism thing is all Hitler reinterpreting the idea of the Übermensch as a racial thing, when there's no mention of race, at least in this one. I haven't read all of Nietzsche's books, but he explicitly says the only reason women exist is to give birth to the Übermensch, or as it's translated in my edition, the overhuman, which doesn't sound nearly as catchy, to be honest. But that is a lot more of a blot, I think, on the essentially positive, empowering philosophy that Nietzsche presents here in this book. And as much as it's the best antidote in not classical, but in the old school philosophy of the 19th century that I can find for this sort of modern emphasis on community and following the herd, with people like Kate Tempest or Russell Brand disparaging the individual. It's the best antidote for that. But things like the misogynism in this book, even if it's just a tiny bit, I think it's just one section and a few mentions here or there, it sort of gives them ammunition to diss the individual, if you know what I mean. I've sort of gone into rap language now, but I think I've got my message across. I'd be a massive hypocrite if I were to complain about that, though. That's not a proper complaint. That's just a sort of little bit of the book that doesn't sit comfortably with me personally. But I'm not going to disparage it or say it's shit because of that little thing I disagree with. I think if I were to put one major legitimate criticism of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, not just as a work of ideas and philosophy, but as a work of not literature, but the written word, I would say that it's just quite samey in a lot of ways. The verbal experimentation and the stylistic unusualness, abnormality of the book does allow you to forget that while he does occasionally bring in some new ideas, a lot of it is just him rewording his point about, oh, we shouldn't pity people because they don't like being pitied, and the human is something to be overcome. And it's just, I mean, as much as I've already said, I'm very much pro Nietzsche in his philosophies. It's almost quite tiresome to just have it like, this, over and over again, and it's the same thing. At least 70% of the book is him reiterating the same ideas, and it's only about 280 pages long, but it could be about half the length. He doesn't need to say the same thing in very slightly different ways over and over again. The last section and the first section are probably the two strongest. The first section actually does examine sort of lots of different parts of the world in a way that a traditional philosophy book would, and applies them to Nietzschean ideas. And the last section is almost a proper narrative with chapters and characters that return. And I mean, that's probably the most difficult to interpret as well. But those two sections need to be there. But the middle two sections are sort of a weird blend between the two styles that often seem to have little sort of skits or scenarios which prove once and again Nietzsche's ideas and philosophy over and over again without much difference in what he's actually trying to say. So my review's already over. I've been struggling to do this review more than normal because I think it's quite a difficult thing to review. It's always inevitably going to come down to my own opinions on what Nietzsche's saying rather than the quality or lack of the book. But despite its beauty of language and its soundness of theory, the sameness and the sort of overzealousness of the language sort of brings it down a little bit. It did get a little bit much, even in the 280 pages, without much variation on theme or idea. So I'm going to give it a B, which is still quite a high B. On my Goodreads account, I very nearly gave it a 5 stars. It was just those slight flaws which didn't quite qualify it.